This episode decodes the famous book, The Selfish Gene. Even if you haven't read the book, you must have heard of this concept. This book is the work that made its author, Richard Dawkins, famous. It is also one of the most classic popular science books on evolutionary theory. Its impact was so significant that after the book was published, the selfish gene even became a fixed phrase in English. The book has 384 pages. I will introduce the essence from the book in about 20 minutes. Before we dive in, please click on the subscribe button to stay updated with Daily Book Dive. Okay, we will answer the following 3 questions. First, what exactly is Dawkins' selfish gene? Second, what's the use case of understanding the concept of self-gene? And finally, if genes are selfish, why do we still see so many altruistic behaviors in nature? Part 1. Let's start with the first part. What exactly is the selfish gene? Nobel laureate Jacques Monod once said, "The peculiar thing about the theory of evolution is that everyone thinks they understand it." This statement also applies to the selfish gene. Many people interpret the title literally, thinking that the book warns that humans and animals have genes that make them appear selfish. But this is not Dawkins' intent. In his view, all genes, note, all genes are selfish. Each gene has its own interests, and there can be conflicts of interest between genes and between genes and organisms. More importantly, these selfish genes are not means for organisms to ensure their survival and reproduction. Quite the opposite, organisms are merely tools for genes to continually create and propagate themselves. In scientific terms, Dawkins is saying that genes are the basic unit of natural selection and self-interest, not organisms. For those encountering Dawkins' views for the first time, this theory is counterintuitive and seems exaggerated. Darwin's natural selection speaks of the birth, illness, and death of organisms and the survival of the fittest species. It appears that the ones undergoing harsh natural selection are the organisms. How can it be the genes? To clarify this, we need to understand what kind of entity can be selected by nature. There are 2 criteria. First, the entity must have the ability to self-replicate. Only then, when it has an advantage, can it continuously replicate and spread itself, eventually defeating its competitors. If it cannot replicate, the advantage it painstakingly built would vanish upon its death, rendering natural selection meaningless. The second criterion is stability. The entity must be stable enough for nature to have sufficient time to select a winner between it and its competitors. Do organisms meet these 2 criteria? The answer is no. Firstly, organisms do not meet the self-replication criterion. This might seem strange because organisms can reproduce, right? But for most organisms, their offspring are a mix of the traits of both parents, not a complete copy of either parent. From the perspective of an organism, once it dies, that copy is lost forever. Secondly, organisms do not meet the stability criterion, since each organism has only one copy of itself, and this copy has a short lifespan. No matter how well it adapts to nature, it will age and die. Compared to the long evolutionary timeline, an organism's lifespan of a few years to a few decades is too short for natural selection. Therefore, organisms are not suitable as the basic unit of natural selection. So what does meet the criteria? There's something like the pyramids in the desert, which remains unchanged over time. The gene, the basic unit of genetic information discovered in the mid-20th century. The most important characteristic of genes is stability. In high school biology, we learned that genes are mainly distributed on chromosomes. Unless a gene mutation occurs, genes remain intact regardless of how cells divide. Thus, as organisms reproduce, genes move from the individual of the previous generation to the next, passing down through generations and surviving for millions or even billions of years. This long period is sufficient for natural selection to act, selecting those genes with stronger adaptability. Theoretically, this makes sense, but is there evidence for this theory? Dawkins provides numerous hard-to-refute examples. For instance, according to the traditional view, if natural selection is to screen out superior organisms, then after millions of years of evolution, organisms' survival ability should increase, leading to longer lifespans, possibly even immortal organisms. But why do most organisms still die? To Dawkins, this shows that nature is selecting superior genes, not superior organisms. For organisms, the optimal choice is to live as long as possible. But for genes, the lifespan of the host organism is less important. The crucial thing is to spread their copies as much as possible while the host is alive. If a gene can produce a large number of offspring carrying its copy, then it has succeeded. If we compare organisms to a ship and genes to passengers, then what genes have been doing is making more new ships while the current ship hasn't sunk, then jumping onto the new ones. The above is a macro-level example. On a micro-level, at the cellular level, Dawkins also found evidence supporting his hypothesis. We know that sexually reproducing organisms have two complete sets of genetic material in each normal cell. During reproduction, genes at the same position on these two sets have a 50% chance of entering sperm or egg cells through meiosis. Normal meiosis is like a completely fair lottery, where each gene and its counterpart on the other set have the same chance of being passed to the next generation. However, genes are inherently selfish. To maximize their chances of winning, genes will try everything, even tampering with meiosis, to increase their probability of entering reproductive cells. Take the T gene in mice as an example. The T gene is very harmful to the survival of mice. When only one set of genetic material carries the T gene, the mouse is healthy. But when both sets carry the T gene, the mouse will die. So for the species, the fewer T genes, the better. However, the T gene wants to survive too. If you examine the sperm of a male mouse carrying the T gene, you'll find that the T gene has cheated. 95% of the sperm carry the T gene, while only 5% contain normal genes. This gives the offspring of male mice a high probability of carrying the T gene, quickly spreading it through a mouse population, ultimately leading to the population's near extinction. Although this is an extreme example, it proves that the interest of an organism and its genes are not always aligned. Genes prioritize their interests, disregarding the host organism's interests. This is strong evidence for the selfish gene hypothesis at the molecular biology level. This concludes the first part of the book. The author introduces the selfish gene hypothesis, which posits that the basic unit of evolution is the gene, not the organism. We think genes serve the survival of organisms, but this is an illusion. In reality, we are carriers for genes, and genes are our hosts. Part 2. Some might ask, besides being novel, what practical significance does the selfish gene hypothesis have? To answer this, Dawkins lists numerous fascinating phenomena in nature that can only be reasonably and reliably explained using the selfish gene hypothesis. We will now discuss examples from insects, vertebrates, and humans. Let's start with an example of social insects. We are familiar with social insects like bees, ants, and termites. They share a common trait. All members of a colony are born from one mother, usually called the queen. The queen doesn't work. Her only task is to reproduce. Among the offspring, males are responsible for mating, and females differentiate into various types. Some gather food, some care for the young, and others defend and fight. These diligent females are called workers. Early on, humans discovered that these insects have strict hierarchies. The queen is exalted, enslaving her children to fulfill her desires, while the workers seem very altruistic, working tirelessly and even sacrificing themselves if necessary. But is this altruism real? Dawkins believes this is actually a facade created by selfish genes. Workers are not the queen's slaves. Instead, they actively feed the fertile queen, driving her to increase her reproductive capacity to better replicate their genes. Let's see why this is the case. First, whether it's bees or ants, the queen mates with a single male once in her lifetime, storing his sperm for future use. The queen continually lays eggs. Fertilized eggs develop into females, most of whom become workers, while unfertilized eggs develop into males. This sex system results in an unusual outcome. Because males develop from unfertilized eggs, they carry only one set of genetic material. This genetic material is entirely passed on to their sperm, while the queen carries two complete sets, with each set having a 50% chance of entering an egg cell. Dawkins introduces a concept called the coefficient of relatedness, indicating the probability that two relatives share the same gene. For a worker developing from a fertilized egg, it shares 100% of its genetic material from the father with another worker sister, and 50% of its genetic material from the mother, making the coefficient of relatedness between worker sisters 3/4, while the coefficient between a worker and the queen is only 1/2. This means that workers are more closely related to their sisters than to the queen. This is a critical conclusion, implying that worker sisters would band together, using their mother as a breeding machine. Hence, the queen is influenced by the workers, laying as many female eggs as possible, resulting in a sex ratio of 3:1, aligning with theoretical predictions, proving that social insect queens are actually enslaved by the selfish genes within the workers. If selfish genes can explain insects, let's look at more advanced organisms. Vertebrates. We'll discuss population control in animal species. The term population control is familiar, but few might know that it exists in nature. How does natural population control come about? The famous Malthusian law in sociology states that in an uncontrolled state, the population grows geometrically. Once the population exceeds the resource limit, the excess population will be eliminated. This law applies not only to humans, but also to animal populations. Zoologists observe that species like lemmings and Canadian lynxes, unable to control their numbers, breed madly when resources are plentiful and starve in large numbers when resources are depleted. However, many animal populations actively regulate their numbers. Observing certain birds in nature, we find that when population numbers are low, they hatch more offspring, but when populations are overcrowded, they actively reduce their clutch size. How is this done? British zoologist Wynne Edwards suggested that these birds limit their offspring for the benefit of the entire population during resource shortages. But this is hard to justify, as such self-sacrificing birds would be replaced by more prolific ones. Dawkins argues that only the selfish gene hypothesis can explain this phenomenon. As previously mentioned, the hypothesis posits that natural selection occurs at the gene level, and organisms only need to maximize the interests of the genes they carry. However, for genes, although theoretically, the more offspring, the better, raising offspring is arduous. For example, a female great tit must return to the nest every 30 seconds during the day to feed its chicks. Clearly, if a female bird distributes limited food and energy among too many offspring, fewer would survive to adulthood. Therefore, raising an optimal number of offspring is a meticulous task. Too few is insufficient, and too many is detrimental. So, genes must have ways to control birds, enabling them to judge how many offspring to raise based on current resource conditions. Scientists found that different birds have various methods of judgment. For example, social starlings determine the population number by the loudness of birdsong in their habitat. If a female starling finds the habitat's birdsong very loud, it indicates an overcrowded population and impending famine, prompting her to reduce her clutch size, and vice versa. Is this hypothesis reliable? Scientists conducted an experiment playing two different recordings to two groups of starlings during their breeding season. One recording had very loud birdsong, while the other had sparse birdsong. As expected, the group exposed to loud birdsong laid significantly fewer eggs than the other group. Following this logic further, we can also explain another natural phenomenon. Animal documentaries often show birds gathering in flocks, flying over marshlands. It was long unclear why birds deliberately gather. Now we know that many birds adjust their clutch size based on other birds' songs. To increase their own egg-laying and reduce that of others, selfish genes make birds appear as if the population density is high, so each bird gathers and sings loudly to confuse others, ultimately securing more resources for their offspring. Thus, although population control appears to be an individual sacrifice for the group's benefit, it is still driven by selfish genes. Finally, let's see if the selfish gene hypothesis applies to humans. We say parental love is the deepest, followed by sibling love, then the care of other relatives, with varying degrees of closeness depending on the blood relationship. Dawkins believes this also relates to selfish genes. Using the coefficient of relatedness, which indicates the probability that two relatives share the same gene. For humans, the coefficient between parents and children is 1/2, and between siblings is also 1/2. But considering half-siblings, the average coefficient is less than 1/2, making parents closer than siblings. For third cousins, the coefficient drops to 1/128, nearly the level of strangers. This difference in the coefficient perfectly aligns with the varying levels of care shown to different relatives, indicating that kinship is also influenced by selfish genes. This concludes the second part of the book. The author lists numerous natural phenomena that can be reasonably explained only by the selfish gene hypothesis. We introduced examples from social insects, vertebrates, and humans. Dawkins believes that selfish genes are a universal phenomenon, widespread in all organisms. Part 3. But if this is true, wouldn't nature be filled with selfishness and behaviors disguised as altruism? Many criticisms of Dawkins' view stem from this, arguing that the selfish gene hypothesis contradicts human experience, especially since human society has many noble moral behaviors. Dawkins responds to these criticisms using the famous game theory. Those familiar with game theory know the term prisoner's dilemma. There are various versions of the prisoner's dilemma, but simply put, it is a single round game where if both players choose to cooperate, both receive a reward. If both betray, both are punished. But if one cooperates and the other betrays, the betrayer receives a higher reward than if both cooperated, while the betrayed is punished more severely than if both had chosen to betray. In this game, the rational choice for each player is to betray, minimizing their losses regardless of the opponent's choice. In animal societies, the selfish nature of genes leads organisms into a single-round prisoner's dilemma. However, fortunately, nature is filled with many scenarios of repeated, indefinite rounds of games. Examples include gorillas grooming each other and birds removing parasites from each other. According to American political scientist Robert Axelrod's research, in such scenarios, cheating strategies easily fail after a few rounds of advantage, while predominantly tolerant and kind strategies prevail. So, what is the best strategy? The top-ranked strategy is tit for tat. This strategy has two features. The first is reciprocity. When the opponent chooses to cooperate, this strategy also cooperates, but if betrayed once, it retaliates by betraying in the next round. The second feature is forgiveness. Even after being deceived once, it continues to cooperate if the opponent cooperates thereafter. This simple strategy requires minimal memory, needing only to remember the opponent's last action. Moreover, it is an effective evolutionary strategy. In a tit-for-tat, dominant environment, stable mutual cooperation arises, and those inclined to betrayal are easily eliminated. To validate this conclusion, Dawkins provides examples in his book, the most typical being cleaner fish. Cleaner fish and shrimp clean parasites from the teeth and gills of larger fish. The larger fish get cleaned, and the cleaner fish get food, forming a typical mutualistic relationship. However, both parties face risks. Cleaner fish risk being eaten by larger fish, while larger fish risk small predatory fish posing as cleaners to enter their gills and take a bite of flesh. To mitigate these risks, cleaner fish evolve distinctive markings and swimming styles for recognition. And larger fish avoid fraudulent predators by visiting designated cleaning stations. Once locations are fixed and both parties have identifiable features, an indefinite round game naturally forms, enabling stable altruistic behavior to persist. Thus, altruism is not a disguise. It is also encoded in selfish genes. To summarize, this audio episode provides a comprehensive overview of the book. Let's recap. First, the author dismantles the human-centric illusion. He points out that humans, like other organisms, are carriers of genes. The existence of organisms serves to better replicate and spread their genes. In extreme cases, genes may harm their host organisms to propagate themselves, which is the selfish gene hypothesis. Second, the hypothesis offers a new perspective on nature. It helps us explain complex phenomena like natural population control with more elegance and simplicity. Last, the author argues that despite genes being selfish, this doesn't mean nature is filled with selfishness. Due to the presence of numerous indefinite repeated games in nature, selfish genes can also evolve altruistic behaviors. After covering the core content of this book, I want to mention a point Dawkins subtly makes. The selfish gene isn't just about biology. Dawkins extends evolutionary theory to human culture, proposing that many cultural phenomena, such as language, songs, religion, fashion, eating habits, and even technological knowledge, undergo evolution similar to nature. Genes are transmitted through reproductive cells, while cultural phenomena are transmitted through human imitation. Like genes, cultural phenomena compete with each other, with those more useful or appealing surviving and spreading. If genes are the hosts of organisms, cultural phenomena are the hosts of human brains. Dawkins coined the term meme for these cultural units. Today, the term meme is included in the Oxford English Dictionary, and its influence rivals that of selfish gene. Thus, using an evolutionary perspective to analyze human society is no longer seen as extraordinary. This concept, which profoundly impacted the world, was introduced in just one chapter, yet it established a new field. That's the essence of this book. The original book link is attached at the end for further reading. You can also click the share button below the video to share this book with your friends. Congratulations, you finished another book.